Oh my goodness. So, hello to everyone. It is the 14th of March 2024, 11:26 Central European Time, and we're just doing one of our last live streaming we're going to do for now. On the subject of psychoanalysis, Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, Lacan, Freud, etc., etc. We hope to be publishing a podcast, reassuming all of this in hopefully a more logical way. And I just want to cover a few quick points, which I missed. Well, one point specifically, which I did not get to or missed last evening. We were talking about Nietzsche, the will to power, and specifically the plurality of forces as being the will of power. And the general idea was this was, at least from Deleuze's perspective, a fundamental element in the rejection of Freud. Freud's consideration that desire is essentially defined for a man, a woman, whatever, throughout his life to be a lack. Lacan will develop this even further, even though Lacan will push these concepts to its limits, and therefore kind of how could you say it, kind of by pushing these concepts to his limits, kind of create the conditions for the overcoming of some of these concepts, which Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, we all know, took this to task very seriously. And so the point last night was all about the will to power as being innocent, active forces, which always must be considered as a plurality of forces. The will to power we defined as a transcendental faculty, which has little operation on matter. However, the will seeks to dominate over other wills in a transcendental, on a transcendental, let's call it plane for now. And the only thing I kind of missed out on last night was the role of reactive forces, and that's what I wanted to get into now, because as far as we got last night, looking at Deleuze's Nietzsche and philosophy, we defined the will in itself to be fundamentally innocent, beyond morality, or in a pre-moral state, let's say, in its natural state, as being productive, meaning seeking relations towards other wills for other subjects, objects, or whatever, making connections in the world, to say very bluntly, simply. And the will to power in itself is a plurality of forces, and these forces are innocent, productive, and always want to dominate the forces in another subject, another object, or whatever, anything in the sensible manifold, anything in the real, anything in the world. And therefore we can, without getting too much into it, we kind of have tied together the desire, Nietzsche's will, and becoming is kind of sort of the same thing, just for convenience's sake. However, you can go on in debate about the differences, just as you can debate about the differences between Spinoza's concept of emotions and affects and Nietzsche's, etc., etc. But just to keep things simple, to fully understand it, I think it's better that we don't get into those kind of distinctions. So I'm going to get really quickly into reactive forces, which is something that we missed last evening. We only talked about active forces. I'm going to go back to Nietzsche and Philosophy by Gilles Deleuze and start a little bit earlier just because there's some ideas and concepts which I do find to be quite interesting. Let me see what in God's name is going on with my microphone here. There we go. And just very briefly, and hopefully we'll get into this on our podcast. We're actually thinking of working very quickly on this book which arrived today, which I recommend to anyone out there watching us or following us. I believe this is from 1962, which is one of the first collaborations between Pierre-Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze. Here's the book here. So Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Politique et psychoanalyse, l'interprétation des énoncés. Translated as the political and psychoanalysis and the interpretation of enunciations. And this is very old school. I absolutely love the typography. Once upon a time, this is what is it? OG. This is original gangster stuff. That's how things were published way back in the days. Not 200,000 sexy fonts, just one typewriter style, just to show you some of the pages. And hopefully we'll get into this book a little bit on live streaming form and eventually on the podcast itself. And this book is divided into 4 chapters, and apparently the author in the preface himself says he just received a bunch of papers and it was up to the publisher himself to kind of divide to make sense of that huge mess of papers he got and do his best to divide it into 4 chapters. So the 4 chapters are here. I can get them to focus. So the first chapter we have Psychoanalyse et politique by Félix Guattari, psychoanalysis and the political. Then we have 4 propositions sur la psychanalyse, 4 propositions for psychoanalysis by Gilles Deleuze. Now the third part is l'interprétation des énonces, the interpretation of enunciations. Obviously, enunciations in this context concerns patients who suffer from psychosis or schizophrenia. And here we have 4 authors. We have Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Claire Parnay, and André Scala. And then finally we have La place du signifiant dans l'institution, the place of the signifier within the institution by Félix Guattari. So hopefully in the next week or so we'll get a little bit into this, which I highly recommend for anyone interested in these kind of subjects. And I think it's also a very, very valuable tool helping to understand the anti-Oedipus. So I'm going to jump as quickly as possible. It's very late here into Nietzsche and philosophy. I'm just going to read very quickly, and our goal here is to get into reactive forces so we understand. You could say that the Deleuze-Guattarian critique of Freud, to keep things simple, is defining the human will, and will is not only obviously left to humans, and we'll get into this in Nietzsche and philosophy very quickly. However, is always must be a plurality. There must be at least 2 essential forces, and Schopenhauer's great mistake, which Nietzsche repudiated, was that Schopenhauer reduced to the will as one unitary single force, and there are echoes of this in Freud, where he essentially interprets the will in childhood as a sexual drive, and therefore everything, according to Sigmund Freud, is run through this filter in which plurality of forces is reduced to one unitary force, a single force, which is the sexual drive, which leads to all of its kind of the core of Freud's structuralist free association and symbolism. So just very quickly, the child seeks to be the object of desire of his mother. However, his mother desires his father because his father has a phallus much larger than his. Therefore, he has castration anxiety, and this will go on to the essentially create the so-called patriarchy, where it's father who rules the family, and according to Freud, that's because the father has the biggest phallus, and the phallus is essentially the object of the desire of the mother, etc., etc. So once we get into post-structuralist interpretation with Deleuze and Guattari, they will say there's a plurality of forces. Yes, we have the sex drive. Okay, that's a part of our will, is sexual domination, pleasure, etc., etc. But that's only one of a multiplicity of many forces, and that's Freud's huge mistake, is to reduce the will to a singular force, e.g. the sexual drive, instead of considering this immense plurality of forces and the differential relationship between both our own internal forces and the own internal forces of other people, other animals, objects, whatever we may encounter. And so if I go back to Nietzsche in Philosophy, page 62, we have the will to power must therefore manifest itself in force as such. The manifestations of the will to power must be studied very carefully, because the dynamism of forces is completely dependent on it. But what does the will to power manifest itself mean? The relationship between forces in each case is determined to the extent that each force is affected by other inferior or superior forces. So, we know already that let's say eventually the will to power, the will are innocent, active forces which seek to dominate other active forces which it encounters. And here, part of, let's call it the definition of a force in itself, is its capacity or ability to be affected by other forces if they are either inferior, more powerful, or inferior, less powerful, or superior, more powerful. And already here, with the power to affect and be affected, we already hear the echoes of Spinoza, obviously in Nietzsche. And it follows that the will to power is manifested as a capacity for being affected. This capacity is not an abstract possibility. It is necessarily fulfilled and actualized at each moment by the other forces to which a given force relates. So at each moment in which forces create a relation, who will determine who will dominate, because both forces are encountering each one another, and both forces are seeking to dominate forces of their kind which they may encounter. However, the differential relationship, who is stronger, who is weaker, between these two forces will be defined not abstractly but concretely, by the capacity of each force on its own to be affected. We should not be surprised by the double aspect of the will to power. From the standpoint of the genesis or production of forces, it determines the relation between forces, but from the standpoint of its own manifestations, it is determined by relating forces. So in the end, sounds complicated, not really. These forces, every individual has its unique, inherent will as a transcendental faculty, and within itself you cannot qualify or determine that force until it encounters another force, and when those forces encounter, they clash, they conflict with one another. That will determine, let's say, the quality of each, that will qualify each force, essentially through each force's capacity to be affected. So this is why the will to power is always determined at the same time as it determines, qualified at the same time as it qualifies. Why? Quite simple, because this relation between forces is obviously not static. It is constantly, at every moment in time, renewing itself. It is a flux. It is a flow. It is something constantly occurring in the relationship between forces. They can be more stable or less stable, but they're constantly in a condition of flux between themselves. They're constantly conflicting with one another. In the first place, therefore, the will to power is manifested as the capacity for being affected, as the determinate capacity of force for being effective. It is difficult to deny, as I said before, a Spinozist inspiration here. Spinoza, in an extremely profound theory, wanted a capacity for being affected to correspond to every quantity of force. The more ways a body could be affected, the more force it had, meaning simply the more sensible you are to being affected by a wider variety of things determines your own capacity to affect other people. Not difficult to understand, and this is a simple example. We have affects and concepts, but think of a person who lives in a small village all of his life in which nothing ever really happens, so he's going to be affected by a reasonably small number of things during his lifetime. However, if someone is living in, I don't know, Paris or London, in a big city, he's going to theoretically have a much theoretically, because all people are different, but in theory he will be affected by a much vaster degree of difference, of other cultures, of other people, of all of the things that city life brings with itself, and therefore theoretically being affected by many kinds of other different forces, that person would have a greater capacity in his body to affect other people, other objects, whatever. The more ways a body could be affected, the more force it had. This capacity measures the force of a body or expresses its power. And, on the same hand, this power is not a simple logical possibility, for it is actualized at every moment by the bodies to which a given body is related. So once again, This has a lot to do with Deleuze's concept of the event, but on a transcendental plane where the will operates. These forces are always in a constant state of, let's say, struggle between themselves. And this obviously creates effects on the material plane, the actual, the virtual, and the actual. We can bring it down to that substantially. So everything on a transcendental plane is a constant flux of wills or of desires or becoming. I know we're grouping them together, but just to make things a little bit simpler. And it's constantly in a state of flux, and this is constantly affecting the actual world, matter, essentially. Think, for example, we look into the examples of the famous, well-known examples of the wood carver who, a tree is kind of an effect of the forces that created it. If it's a living tree, those forces are still active and are still at play and still changing every minute. So maybe your wood grain up until 1 meter will be like this, and then your wood grain will swirl around, and you'll have a knot here and a knot here, and then your wood grain is going to change and go up over here, and you're going to have a knot here, a knot here. And this is essentially what we looked at yesterday. The tree, according to Deleuze and Nietzsche, is an expression or an effect of the transcendental forces at play that are constantly shifting, changing from a Nietzschean perspective through power relations. And therefore, like an object in the sensible manifold, the sensory manifold, is an effect, a product of what's going on the virtual or transcendental plane. This capacity measures the force of a body or expresses its power. And on the one hand, this power is not a simple logical possibility, for it is actualized at every moment by the bodies to which a given body is related. On the other hand, this capacity is not a physical passivity. The only passive affects are those not adequately caused by the given body. So, on the other hand, this capacity is not a physical passivity, and once again, the will does not operate directly on matter. However, the relation, it's the plurality of wills on a transcendental plane that affects matter to the extent that matter or phenomenon in the sensory manifold are effects of the forces at play on the virtual transcendental plane. The only passive affects are those not adequately caused by the given body. So the only passive affects belong to bodies that are not adequate enough to give these affects enough force to affect the will of other beings, objects, etc., etc. So I don't want to go too. I did want to get a little bit into Pathos, because with Nietzsche, we have to go back to Aristotle and look a little bit about how Nietzsche relates the will to power and eventually emotions to Pathos. And Pathos is obviously one of Aristotle's formulas for persuasion in rhetoric, or we can think about a public speaker. And just very briefly, Pathos is the capacity to appeal to the emotion of a public. So a really wise, talented Greek speaker in the amphitheater in the times of Aristotle, through his wisdom, would be trained and know how to kind of play the chords of the public and appeal to them emotionally, and that's an important factor for the definition of the will to power for Nietzsche through Aristotelian pathos, but we don't have much time left, so we will get hopefully back to that later, because we want to skip right now to, if we can get there, my goodness, the becoming reactive of forces. And this was the important point we missed last night, so I'm going to just read straight into this. But the dynamic of forces, in fact, leads us to a distressing conclusion. When reactive force separates active force from what it can do, the latter also becomes reactive. So, we're adding an entirely new element right here. We now not only possess entirely active forces, we also possess reactive forces, and reactive forces have the capacity to separate active forces from themselves, meaning from their power, therefore transforming active forces into reactive forces. We're going to take a 2-minute break, and I'll get right back into this very quickly. Okay, so we are back here and now getting into reactive forces, which initially we might find quite surprising. So, as we stated before, but the dynamic of forces, in fact, leads us to a distressing conclusion. When reactive force separates active force from what it can do, the latter also becomes reactive. Active forces become reactive, and the word becoming must be taken in the strongest sense. The becoming of forces appears as a becoming reactive. Important point here, appears as a becoming reactive. Are there no other ways of becoming? Interesting phrase. The fact remains that we do not feel, experience, or know any becoming but becoming reactive. We are not merely noting the existence of reactive forces, we are noting the fact that everywhere they are triumphant. So how do they triumph? They triumph through the will to nothingness, thanks to the affinity between reaction and negation. What is negation? It is a quality of the will to power, the one which qualifies it as nihilism or will to nothingness, the one which constitutes the becoming reactive of forces. I think there's no need to translate here. Everything is perfectly clear. Not translate, explain, whatever, but it's all pretty clear. It must not be said that active force becomes reactive because reactive forces triumph. On the contrary, they triumph because by separating active force from what it can do, they betray it to the will of nothingness, to a becoming reactive deeper than themselves. This is why the figures of triumph of reactive forces, ressentiment, bad conscience, and the ascetic ideal are primarily forms of nihilism. And let's just punch up for those who might ask themselves what the ascetic ideal is. Ascetic. Oh, thank you very much. The ascetic ideal. Ascetic meaning avoiding physical pleasures and living a simple life, often for religious reasons. So obviously the reference here is to an ascetic monastic life, which through reactive forces rejects the pleasures, not necessarily the sexual pleasures, because we always have a plurality of forces. Rejects in general the pleasures of life in favor of a kind of a monastic kind of punishment in the name of faith, religion, etc., etc. This is why the figures of triumph of reactive forces, as we said before, are primarily forms of nihilism. The becoming reactive, the becoming nihilistic of force seem to be essential components of the relation of force with force. So becoming reactive or becoming nihilistic would seem to be an essential component of the relation of force with force. Is there any other becoming? Obviously, for Deleuze, this is an important question because he's asked that at least 5 times in this paragraph. Everything tempts us to think that perhaps there is. So everything tempts us to believe that perhaps there is another form of external relation or becoming which is not a form of nihilism. But as Nietzsche often says, we would need another sensibility, another way of feeling. We cannot yet reply to this question. We can hardly even contemplate its possibility, but we can ask why we only feel and know a becoming reactive. So up until this point, we have kind of a very, very pessimistic vision of the will, in such that reactive forces are also inherent within our wills, and the reactive forces are nihilistic forces, a will to nothingness, a will to resentment, a will to bad conscience, a will to the ascetic ideal, and these are forces which form a part of the plurality of forces which form each's own will. And essentially, what Deleuze is saying here is that, unfortunately, becomings, because I do believe from a Deleuzian point of view that existence is essentially a series of becomings. It's about external relationships, essentially. Not necessarily, not always, but for the human species, let's say, external relations are a fundamental factor of our existence. Unfortunately, up until today, more or less, most of these becomings have been defined through a sort of nihilism, meaning that our inherent reactive forces convince our active forces to renounce their active power, and they turn them against us, ourselves, in a sort of will to nothingness. So Deleuze is saying there is another form of becoming, but as Nietzsche often says, we would need another sensibility or another way of feeling. Essentially, we have to be up to the task of positive, active becomings, and not perpetually creating becomings which are fundamentally reactive, negative, and nihilistic. However, up until, let's just say today, for lack of a better word, unfortunately, these nihilistic becomings are the vast majority, according to Nietzsche and Deleuze, of the relationships, the becomings that we have with others and the world. So, is it not because man is essentially reactive? Because becoming reactive is constitutive of man. Ressentiment, bad conscience, and nihilism are not psychological traits, but the foundation of the humanity and man. So here I think we have to think of the Übermensch, the Overman by Nietzsche, and also this overcoming proposed by Deleuze of the traditional image of thought. We can call that kind of a human image of thought. So here we're talking about essentially overcoming being a human, because the will in itself inherently is populated by many reactive forces which overcome our innocent, productive, active forces. So This is one aspect that I think, I'll just say this very quickly. I don't want to get into opinions here, but I remember years ago everyone was talking about Deleuze and overcoming the human, post-human, singularities, all this stuff. But what Deleuze was saying, in my opinion, was something much more simpler and much more profound. He's saying that due to a whole number of reasons, you can think about Henri Bergson, due to the fact that the man is, however you want to think about it, essentially an animal, that we have nervous systems, we get hungry, we get impatient, we get thirsty, and we are kind of essentially at the core level how could you say it, slaves to our nervous system, slaves to the needs of our organism, essentially. And therefore, on a transcendental plane, a human could also be defined through possessing reactive forces, which obviously separate active forces from their power and lead us to a will to nothingness. But like everything great, and this is such a great. The whole book is great, and I think these concepts are wonderful. However, you could really distill that into like a really simplistic level that, what am I thinking about? Apocalypse Now, when the general says, that, what's his name, Colonel Kurtz has overcome the better angels of his nature and quite obviously gone insane, for example, and also the better angel of his nature essentially refers to the fact that we are animals, we have reactive forces, however, at the same time, we are gifted, or we do possess faculties of active forces which can overcome reactive forces. However, unfortunately, that is something in humankind which is very rare. Moving on. Is it not because man is essentially reactive? Because becoming reactive is constituted of man. Ressentiment, bad conscience, and nihilism are not psychological traits, but the foundation of humanity in man. They are the principle of human being as such. Man, skin disease of the earth, reaction of the earth. That is Zarathustra, also Sprachta Zarathustra, chapter 2 of Great Events. Deleuze continues, it is in this sense that Zarathustra speaks of his great contempt for man and of his great disgust. Another sensibility, another becoming, would they still be man? So I don't want to get back to opinion like I did before, but when we're talking about overcoming the human, we are not talking about man merging with artificial intelligence or machines, blah, 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 blah. Simply what Deleuze, echoing Nietzsche, is saying here is that man, defined as the image of man or the image of thought of man, up until now, until recently, the 18th century, but also today, I don't think much has changed, is that man is essentially nihilistic, suffers from ressentiment, and is fundamentally dominated by reactive forces. However, man does possess active forces, which, if man learned to possess this sensibility, man will be capable of creating becomings, relations, external relations with the world around him, which could be innocent, positive, active forces, like for Nietzsche was Zarathustra, but even in Spinoza's terms, mankind is still really young. And here we're talking about post-human. That doesn't mean, like Elon Musk says, the singularity is going to come tomorrow and you have a microchip in your brain. Nothing to do with that. Absolutely zero. And I don't want to get into opinion again, but I sincerely hate all of those people that wrote all of this stuff that Deleuze is saying post-human and we're merging with machines and computation. No, fuck you. It has nothing to do with that. It means that man will overcome his tendency as an animal to let his reactive forces overcome and strip his active forces of their true, innocent, productive power and turn them against man. And there's no better. Deleuze has been a scholar of Nietzsche his entire life. He has done he did a lot of work for the Nietzsche Foundation. If anyone knows about Nietzsche, it's Gilles Deleuze, trust me. And when we're talking about post-human, this is simply an image of a people to come in positive becomings. That's the simplest way to put it. Positive can be active in active becomings, and that's the whole heart of this matter on reactive forces. And once again, my thesis and why I'm doing this evening, I missed it yesterday, I didn't have time to get around to it, is that for psychoanalysis, this will be a fundamental issue of Deleuze and Guattari's critique of Freud, and partially also of Jacques Lacan, that by reducing the will from a plurality to a singular force, you are automatically stripping it of its power. 2, by positing desire or the will as an eternal lack, which can never be recovered, is based on a Freudian obsession of sexuality in the infantile stage, and therefore, as an adult, you can never recover that, and you submit your active forces through reactive forces, creating a fundamental lack, and your active forces, desire, will, whatever, will be submitted and turned against yourself, and you will suffer for things that occurred in your childhood, which are already highly speculative. I honestly don't remember that. My extreme youth, but I don't think I was fantasizing about having a phallus like my father. I've never seen my father's phallus. I hope never to, because whatever, but maybe when I was young, those things did happen, and Freud is partially right. Not my problem. So we just want to close up here. The condition of man is one of the greatest importance for the eternal return. It seems to compromise or contaminate it so gravely that it becomes an object of anguish, repulsion, and disgust. Even if active forces return, they will again become reactive, eternally reactive. The eternal return of reactive forces, and furthermore the return of the becoming reactive of forces. Zarathustra not only presents the thought of the eternal return as mysterious and secret, but is nauseating and difficult to bear. I think this is all very clear. Let's do 2 more phrases and we will shut off for the evening. The first exposition of the eternal return is followed by a strange vision of a shepherd, writhing, choking, convulsed, his face distorted, a heavy black snake hanging out of his mouth. This is Zarathustra, chapter 3, of the vision and the riddle. Later, Zarathustra himself explains the vision. The great disgust at man, it choked me and had crept into my throat. The man of whom you are weary, the little man, recurs eternally. Alas, man recurs eternally, an eternal return, even for the smallest. That was my disgust at all existence. Disgust, disgust, disgust. Zarathustra Chapter 3, The Convalescent, pages 235 to 236. So, we are going to sign off right now. We do not want to get into the eternal return, but I think if you followed through this on reactive forces, I think the fundamental concepts are quite clear. We are engulfed in reactive forces. We are engulfed in nihilism. We are engulfed in resentment. However, we are, I know it's contingent, so if I use the word graced, I'm going to get hammered by someone who will say, well, grace is transcendent, but not grace, but we do possess active faculties of power, and all of our becomings do not necessarily have to be reactive becomings, where the reactive forces overcome and convince our active forces to turn against themselves. And as Deleuze stated, once an active force is, let's say, subdued by a reactive force, that active force turns against us, and that active force which turns against us is far more powerful than the reactive force that subdued or convinced that active force to turn around and affect ourselves in a negative way. So, on one hand, quite pessimistic. On the other hand, optimistic. And I'm going to shut off right now. Oh my God, it's very, very late over here. And always a pleasure to talk about Nietzsche. Grande Friedrich Nietzsche. It's always a pleasure. And guys, I'm going to hang up and look out for a few things we're going to be posting on YouTube in the next few days for this text, which should be a lot of fun to look into, and a great way, as this is Anti-Oedipe, this should give us a lot of insight. So anyways, I'm talking too much, guys. Thanks for watching. Take care, and until the next one, good evening.